British cavalry horses stumble through Carolina mud at midnight, riders slumped in their saddles, exhausted from a chase that has lasted for days. Somewhere ahead of them, in 26 miles of black swamp water, the man they are hunting has simply disappeared again. Banastra Tarleton, the most feared cavalry commander in the American colonies, will finally rein in his horse at the edge of a cypress swamp and say something that will outlive every battle he ever won. He will call his enemy a devil, a fox, a ghost that cannot be caught by any mortal soldier. That enemy is not a soldier at all in the way the British understand the word. He is a middle-aged planter with a limp, commanding a militia so small it barely fills a church. So why can an entire British army, the same army that just conquered an entire American state, not catch one man on a horse? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the spring of 1780, to the worst single disaster the American Revolution ever suffered. Charleston, South Carolina, the wealthiest city in the southern colonies, fell to a British siege on May 12, 1780. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered inside the city walls in a single afternoon, the largest capitulation of American forces in the entire war. With Charleston gone, the entire Continental military structure in the South collapsed almost overnight. British General Sir Henry Clinton believed the war in the southern colonies was effectively finished. He sailed back to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in command with orders to pacify the countryside and fold South Carolina permanently back into the British Empire. Royalist militias fanned out across the backcountry, and any patriot who refused to swear loyalty to the crown risked losing his farm, his family, or his life. For most American commanders in the region, there was no army left to command. One officer, however, had missed the surrender entirely, not through cowardice, but through an accident almost too strange to invent. Francis Marion, a 47-year-old planter of French Huguenot descent from the South Carolina Low Country, broke his ankle jumping from a second-story window weeks before the siege, escaping a dinner party where the doors had been locked to keep the wine flowing. Unable to march, he had been sent out of Charleston to recover, and so he was not among the thousands captured when the city fell. Marion was nothing like the dashing cavalry officers of British legend. He stood barely over 5 feet tall, walked with a permanent limp from childhood, and carried none of the polish of a European-trained soldier. He had learned irregular warfare the hard way, fighting Cherokee raiding parties in the 1750s, where there were no open fields, no formal lines, and no rules of gentlemanly combat. That early education would matter more than any West Point classroom ever could. With Charleston gone and the Continental Army in the South reduced to a handful of survivors, Marion did something no British commander expected. He built an army out of almost nothing. He gathered a few dozen men from the Williamsburg district, farmers and swamp trappers armed with their own hunting rifles, some of them barely old enough to shave. He had no uniforms to issue, so his men wore whatever they owned, no gunpowder depot, so they scavenged what they could, and no barracks, so they slept in the open pine barrens of the PD River country. British officers who caught sight of this ragged column reportedly could not stop laughing at the sight of them. They would stop laughing within weeks. On August 20th, 1780, Marion led roughly 50 men in a night raid on a British camp at Nelson's Ferry, near the Great Savannah, striking a column of guards escorting American prisoners captured at the Battle of Camden. In minutes, Marion's men killed or captured over 20 British soldiers and freed more than 150 Continental prisoners, vanishing back into the swamps before any relief force could respond. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a strike, a snatch, a disappearance, over before the British even understood what direction the attack had come from. This became the pattern. Blue Savannah in September, Black Mingo Creek later that same month, Tearcoat Swamp in October. Each raid followed the same design. Identify an isolated British or Loyalist detachment, strike hard and fast under cover of darkness, and retreat before superior numbers could ever be brought to bear. Marion never fought a battle he could lose, because he made sure he never stayed on any battlefield long enough to lose it. Every one of those raids ended in the same place, the tangled river swamps of the PD, ground that swallowed Marion's men whole and spat British pursuers back out exhausted, lost and empty-handed. The PD River swamp was not scenery. It was architecture, and Marion had studied its every wall and doorway since boyhood. Picture cypress trunks rising out of black water like the columns of a flooded cathedral. Their bases flared wide, draped in curtains of gray Spanish moss that hung motionless in the heavy, windless air. The water itself was often no more than knee-deep but utterly opaque, hiding roots, stumps, and sudden drop-offs that could swallow a horse to its chest in an instant. Sound behaved strangely in there. A musket shot could travel for miles across open water, yet 100 men could stand 50 feet away and never be seen through the tangle of vines and fog. Marion's base sat on Snow's Island, a patch of high ground at the junction of the PD and Lynch's rivers, accessible only by canoe through channels his men had memorized, and the British never fully mapped. British cavalry, trained for the open fields of Europe, were almost useless here. A dragoon regiment that could cover 40 miles a day on a turnpike might manage 2 miles an hour wading through mud and thicket. Marion turned every disadvantage of the terrain into an advantage purely because he had spent a lifetime learning to move through it, while every soldier hunting him had spent a lifetime learning to avoid it. His men learned to ford rivers at night using landmarks invisible to outsiders, to muffle horse hooves with cloth, to read a distant flock of startled birds as a warning of an approaching patrol. The swamp fed them too. Fish, waterfowl, wild hogs, meaning Marion's militia needed no long supply train for the British to intercept, no wagons to slow them down, nothing to give away their position. To the British, it looked like empty, worthless wilderness. To Marion, it was a fortress with walls made of water and a moat that reset itself with every tide. By November of 1780, Marion's raids had become such a persistent embarrassment that Lord Cornwallis finally sent his most aggressive officer to end the problem permanently. Banastra Tarleton was 26 years old, ferociously ambitious, and already infamous across the Carolinas for his ruthlessness at the Waxhaws, where his dragoons had cut down surrendering Continental soldiers months earlier. He did not believe in half measures, and he did not believe any American militia could survive a determined pursuit by disciplined British cavalry. Cornwallis gave him a simple mission: find Marion, corner him, and destroy him. Tarleton set out with a mixed force of dragoons and mounted infantry, moving fast through Williamsburg district, burning the homes of suspected Marion sympathizers as he went, hoping to starve out support for the militia. For days he chased rumors and cold trails, always arriving at a campsite to find the ashes still warm and the men long gone. Marion's scouts, ordinary farmers and their sons who knew every back road in the district, tracked Tarleton's movements and fed the information back faster than Tarleton could act on it. Finally, Tarleton believed he had him. Marion's small force was reportedly camped near Ox Swamp, along Jack's Creek, seemingly boxed in by geography with no obvious route of escape. Tarleton pushed his exhausted men through nearly 26 miles of broken country and swamp trail in a single pursuit, certain that this time the fox had finally run out of den. When his advance scouts finally reached the position, they found nothing. No fires, no tracks worth following, no sign that an armed force had ever been there at all. Marion had read the pursuit correctly hours earlier and simply led his men deeper into terrain no British column could safely follow, splitting into smaller groups that reassembled miles away. It was at this exact moment, according to accounts that spread through the Carolinas soon after, that a furious and exhausted Tarleton turned his horse around and declared that the devil himself could not catch this old fox in these swamps. Whether or not the words were spoken exactly that way, the name reached the newspapers, reached the soldiers, reached the enemy Tarleton had failed to catch, and it stuck forever. From that week forward, Francis Marion was the swamp fox, and Tarleton, the man sent specifically to end him, became the reason the legend existed at all. Tarleton gave up the direct pursuit and marched north to rejoin Cornwallis, later meeting a very different kind of American commander on an open cow pasture called Cowpens, a battle that would cost him most of his command. Verify exact chronology of Tarleton rejoining Cornwallis before Cowpens. He never returned to hunt Marion in the swamps again. If a story like this is the kind of history you want more of, This is exactly the channel to stay subscribed to. There is a great deal more of the Revolution's shadow war still to come. Marion's campaign was never designed to win the war by itself, and he knew it. His real target was never a single battle, but the machinery that kept the British Army fed, paid, and moving. Every wagon of supplies his raiders intercepted was a wagon that never reached Cornwallis's main force further north. Every loyalist militia unit that disbanded out of fear of a night raid was one fewer force available to control the countryside. Every prisoner Marion freed from a British escort became another rifle back in American hands within days. This constant grinding pressure meant Cornwallis could never fully trust his hold on South Carolina, forcing him to divert regular troops away from the front lines simply to guard his own supply routes. That diversion of manpower and attention had consequences far beyond the PD swamps. When Nathaniel Greene arrived to rebuild the Continental Army's Southern Command in December 1780, he inherited a British occupation already worn thin by months of Marion's raids, unable to fully consolidate its grip on the region it supposedly controlled. Greene used Marion's local knowledge and his militia's mobility to screen his own army's movements, coordinating strikes that kept Cornwallis reacting instead of advancing. Marion fought alongside Continental regulars at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in September 1781, one of the last major engagements of the Southern Campaign, still leading militia forces more than a year after his first raid at Nelson's Ferry. The British had entered 1780 believing the South was pacified, and by late 1781 they controlled little more than the port cities they had started with. Cornwallis's exhausting pursuit of Greene's army eventually pushed him north into Virginia, and ultimately into a trap at a small tobacco port called Yorktown, where his army surrendered in October 1781. Marion never fired a shot at Yorktown, yet the exhaustion, the diverted troops, and the collapsed loyalist confidence that shaped Cornwallis's decisions in the South all trace back through months of raids most professional soldiers considered beneath their notice. Military strategists still cite Marion's campaign as one of the earliest fully developed templates for irregular warfare fought by a conventional power's own colonial subjects. Hit fast, vanish into terrain the enemy cannot follow, and let logistics do the rest of the damage. The tactics Marion refined in a South Carolina swamp with 50 men and no supply chain would echo, centuries later, through insurgencies fought on entirely different continents. That is the paradox nobody in the British High Command ever solved. They had cannons, they had cavalry, they had the most professional army on the planet, and none of it mattered against a man who refused to give them a battlefield to use it on. Tarleton chased a fox through 26 miles of swamp and caught nothing but his own reflection in black water. Snow's Island today is mostly reclaimed farmland, the old channels silted in, the Cypress Cathedral long since thinned by 2 centuries of logging and drainage. There is little there now to suggest that an army the size of a small village once vanished into it on command, again and again, for over a year. But somewhere in that quiet, ordinary landscape is the answer to the question the British could never quite accept, that the man they could not catch was never really hiding from them at all. He was simply standing exactly where he wanted to be, waiting for them to walk in after him.